Hey guys, tonight we drift softly into the lush valleys and dusty trails of 16th century Central Africa, where monarchs rule from reed-walled courts and alliances shift with the thickness of jungle fog. You're stepping barefoot through the Kingdom of Ndongo, now modern-day Angola, where towering termite mounds rise like crooked temples and drums echo off the distant ridges. Somewhere behind a curtain of hanging vines and chatter from the marketplace, a baby girl is being born into royalty. Her name is Nzinga. And yes, you're about to follow her entire life, from her sharp-tongued childhood to her lion-hearted rise as one of Africa's most cunning, resilient queens. Spoiler, you probably wouldn't survive even 5 minutes in her sandals. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time is where you are. Drop in the comments. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You begin your evening walk in the Kwanzaa River Basin, the air thick with wood smoke and the scent of boiled cassava. The sun dips slowly, buttering the hills in gold. Elephants have passed here recently. Their prints are sunken, fresh, a little muddy. In the distance, a line of women carries calabashes on their heads, humming in unison. But the village you approach today has an unusual buzz. A royal baby has been born, and not just any baby. Nzinga comes into the world around 1583, daughter of Ngola Kiloanji Kia Samba, the king of Ndongo. It's hard to tell if people expect much from her at first. After all, she's not the heir, just one of several royal children, including a brother, Mbandi, who is, let's just say, not the kingdom's most stable shelf. Still, Nzinga shows signs early that she's not like the others. The stories say she spoke fluently before she could walk. That's probably an exaggeration, but it makes sense. This girl learns fast how to listen, how to read a face, how to make grown men lean forward in a council room. You're there as she sneaks out to watch war councils, absorbing battle plans like bedtime stories. Her people, the Mbundu, have lived in this region for centuries. They have rivals, the powerful Kingdom of Congo to the north, smaller tribes at their flanks, and most irritatingly of all, the Portuguese. Those guys have recently arrived on the coast with shiny crosses and not-so-shiny muskets. They're here for trade, they claim. But really, it's human trafficking with bonus sugar. By the time Nzinga is 5 or 6, Ndongo is already resisting Portuguese interference. The king, her father, is deeply entangled in these conflicts, trying to keep trade flowing without handing over his dignity, or worse, his people. Nzinga watches all of this from behind carved wooden screens and around doorways. Her eyes are sharp, her questions sharper. It's also worth mentioning that life for a royal girl isn't just embroidery and flute lessons. Nope, you're dragged through a schedule of spiritual training, learning how to call ancestors, interpret omens, and recite your lineage backwards while carrying a full pot of water on your head. Miss a step, and you'll hear about it from the old aunties for weeks. Nzinga, however, thrives. She's allowed to train in military tactics, rare for girls, and quickly earns the respect of her father's warriors. She also learns Portuguese, one of the earliest in her region to do so, because even as a kid, she knows that speaking your enemy's language is like borrowing their sword. Still, the court is tense. Her brother, Mbandi, is growing up paranoid, jealous, and power-hungry. His advisors whisper that Nzinga is too clever, too confident, too competent. This is the part in the movie where you'd sense trouble ahead, and you'd be right. Now, let's pause for one of those quirky details that historians quietly adore. Some oral traditions claim that Nzinga's umbilical cord was wrapped tightly around her neck at birth. A bad omen, you'd think, but in local belief, it's a sign the child will be a powerful, even dangerous leader. Historians still argue whether this legend was invented later as a retroactive bit of royal branding, but either way, it sticks. Nzinga is born marked. As you drift deeper into this world, the daily sounds around you become familiar. Blacksmiths pounding tools, women sorting maize, children singing songs about crocodiles who wear hats and steal goats. But inside the royal compound, things are tense. Whispers about the Portuguese, failed deals, and worsening raids float like incense smoke. You lie under the stars that night, somewhere just beyond the firelight, as Nzinga dreams of power, not in a childish, greedy way, but in the steely, composed sense that she knows how to wield it if it ever comes her way. She doesn't know it yet, but one day she'll rule 2 kingdoms. She'll outlive multiple viceroys, raise an army from nothing, convert to Christianity just long enough to secure a deal, and famously execute one of her generals during a war council just to make a point. But for now, she's just a girl with braids and a hunger for strategy, learning how to outmaneuver everyone in the room without raising her voice. And as you fade gently towards sleep, picture her there, maybe 9 years old, walking barefoot through the banana grove, planning a better future than any of the adults around her dare to imagine. You wake, still drowsy, still in the same body, but the sun has climbed higher in the sky, and now the scent of dust and palm oil clings to the breeze. You're older now, just as Nzinga is. Maybe 15, maybe 16. Old enough to feel the edge of political winds cutting across the savannah, but still young enough to dodge court responsibilities when the mood strikes. Well, at least you can. Nzinga doesn't get that luxury. Her father, Ndongo, remember, that's not just a name, it's a royal title, is aging, and the Portuguese are becoming more aggressive. There's increasing tension with the Kingdom of Congo, which once had a shaky alliance with Ndongo, but now seems to prefer Portuguese guns and Jesuit priests to the old kinship networks. And with all of this churning in the background, guess who's being groomed to hold it all together? Not Mbandi. Not really. Though he's the eldest son, everyone can see it. He's unstable. Thinks assassination is a valid icebreaker. But Nzinga? She's the steel in the spine of this court. She may not be crowned yet, but her opinion already weighs more than most elders. She walks with confidence. You walk behind her, trying to keep up. She joins councils, not as an observer, as a force. The kind of young woman who will sit through a 4-hour debate about tax grain levies, then cut through the fog with one observation that silences the room. You admire her clarity, and so do the generals. Secretly, many of them trust her more than her brother, which, of course, makes everything more dangerous. At night, when the lamps are low and the air buzzes with cicadas, Nzinga trains in both diplomacy and deception. You see her pore over letters from the Portuguese, dissecting the double meanings. You even help translate a few, if you're lucky. The letters are always polite, always soaked in flattery, and always full of threats. The Portuguese want more enslaved people, more land, more say in how Ndongo is run. In return, they offer things like peace, Christian brotherhood, and, your personal favorite, eternal friendship. Nzinga rolls her eyes so hard it could bend the moon. She's seen what Portuguese friendship means. Whole villages taken overnight, chiefs bribed or poisoned, and the slave trade, still officially denied by the Portuguese crown, has become the continent's slow bleed. Every river crossing has its price. Every town fears being the next one snatched in the dark. It's around this time that Nzinga begins keeping her own network of spies. No one talks about it openly, of course, but you hear rumors. That merchant who visits every week from the coast, he's watching the Jesuits. That elderly woman in the weaving circle, she's listening to Mbandi's drunken speeches. And that boy Nzinga gave a banana to last week, he's probably already memorized half the court gossip and can recite it backwards. Still, you have to admire the girl's finesse. She plays the part of a dutiful sister. Always deferential, always quiet when Mbandi is in the room, unless he invites her to speak. He doesn't know he's being played, and honestly, neither do most of the elders. Let's take a quirky detour here, just to paint the picture. Nzinga reportedly had pet leopards. Plural. kept on chains but trained like dogs. Now, historians debate whether this is literally true or just metaphor, a symbol of her control over dangerous forces. But you can't help imagining her walking one through the marketplace, coconut in one hand, diplomatic letter in the other. There's a long, strange Portuguese word floating around court these days, governator. It means governor, but it might as well mean parasite. The Portuguese governor at Luanda is demanding tribute. More gold, more captives, more loyalty. Her father refuses, which means war. The raids increase. Families disappear. Nzinga begins drafting strategy behind her father's back. Maps, troop placements, river crossing ambushes. You sneak peeks at her plans, scrawled in charcoal on bark scrolls. They're brilliant. She's not even 20. When her father finally dies, some say poisoned, others say he's simply fated, chaos erupts. Mbandi seizes the throne. Not formally, not with ceremony, but with force. He kills or exiles most of Nzinga's allies. It's rumored he has Nzinga's only son murdered, tossed into a river like a warning. Nzinga doesn't weep, doesn't scream. She vanishes for a while. You follow her into the hills, where she gathers allies, rebuilds her networks, and waits. And here's where the tone shifts. Mbandi rules like a man haunted by ghosts. He taxes the poor, makes absurd demands of nobles. He's obsessed with appeasing the Portuguese, offering them captives and land in exchange for peace that never comes. Nzinga, meanwhile, becomes something of a legend. Traders whisper her name in admiration. Women call her a protector. Even some Portuguese traders grudgingly call her that clever lady. The tipping point comes in 1622. Portugal installs a particularly ruthless governor, João Correia de Sousa, and relations with Mbandi hit the fan. He sends his most trusted negotiator to Luanda to try and salvage the situation, his sister, Nzinga. This is it, the moment she becomes more than just a clever girl in the shadows. You walk beside her through Luanda, a city built on both splendor and stolen lives. European-style buildings rise beside slave pens. Jesuits nod politely as soldiers tighten their belts. Nzinga enters the governor's court with nothing but poise and a single entourage. The Portuguese refuse to give her a chair, a political snub. So Nzinga calmly signals to one of her servants, who kneels down and becomes her human stool. She sits, eye level with the governor. She smiles, and then she negotiates a peace deal that freezes the war, returns captives, and earns her respect even from her enemies. That moment, the chair, the calm, the victory cements her. She's not just royalty now. She's a force of nature. As you settle into the stillness of dusk, you hear the soft rustle of palm leaves and the quiet chant of a Mbundu elder telling a story to a small circle of girls. You know who they're talking about. The woman who sat tall when others knelt. The one who plays empires like chess. And her game is just beginning. The deal with the Portuguese holds, briefly. For a few delicate months, there's a hush across Ndongo, like the land itself is exhaling. You can feel it in the stillness of the river at dawn, in the cautious laughter of children playing with nut shells in the dust. And Nzinga? She walks through it all like a storm in disguise. You followed her back from Luanda, back to Mbandi's court, which is somehow even worse than when you left it. Mbandi is spiraling. He drinks too much, trusts no one, and rages about conspiracies that might actually be real, but not the ones he's ranting about. He's furious that his sister has returned as a hero. The whispers say she outshone him in Luanda, that she made the Portuguese blink first, that her servant stool moment is already legend. And Mbandi knows what legends do to insecure kings. At first, he tries to bring her into the fold, makes a show of consulting her, even grants her a governorship in the north. But it's all smoke. He's testing her, watching her, waiting for an excuse. Nzinga doesn't flinch. She plays along, nods in counsel, takes notes. Meanwhile, She starts reorganizing her region, collects taxes more fairly, strengthens defenses, repairs roads. She builds loyalty the way a mason builds a wall, one stone at a time, each one solid. You help her with translations again, Portuguese Kimbundu, sometimes Latin when the Jesuits get verbose. Here's your quirky tidbit of the day. Nzinga allegedly insisted her messengers carry her words in verse form. Literal poetry. Historians debate this. Some think it was a ritual, others think it was camouflage. But you've definitely memorized more iambic couplets about border disputes than you ever expected in this life. And then it happens. Bandy dies. Poison? Suicide? Historians still argue whether it was truly his own hand or someone else's doing him a final, dark favor. Either way, the throne is suddenly vacant. Except it's not, because Nzinga is already moving. Within hours, she declares herself queen. Not sister of the late king, not temporary steward. No, queen. She holds an emergency council. Half the elders panic. The other half breathe a secret sigh of relief. You're standing at the back of the room, and you can see it clearly. She doesn't ask for the crown. She claims it. And here's the twist. She uses Catholicism to do it. Remember that baptism she accepted in Luanda? The Christian name, Ana de Souza, that she took to appease the governor? Well, now she uses it to claim religious legitimacy. She says the Christian God has sanctioned her rule, that the missionaries who blessed her in Luanda recognized her divine right to lead. It's brilliant. Half the court doesn't know what to believe. The other half doesn't care. They just want someone competent in charge. And Nzinga is extremely competent. But the challenges pile up faster than the mangoes in the rainy season. Portuguese raids resume almost immediately. A rival faction declares a puppet king, backed by Lisbon. The Jesuits suddenly start sending letters not to her, but to interim leaders. She responds with an army. You ride with her across hillsides so green they look like paintings. You watch her speak to chiefs one-on-one, calling on old alliances, invoking her father's memory, promising dignity and defense. She doesn't beg for loyalty. She earns it, sometimes one household at a time. But the Portuguese are not to be underestimated. They retake Luanda, press into the countryside, burn villages. Nzinga retreats into the bush, sets up a mobile court, and begins a new phase, Guerrilla Queen. Let's pause to appreciate that title. Guerrilla Queen. Who else gets that? She rides in a war chariot now, keeps a folding chair with her, not for comfort, but for symbolism. When she sits, it means business. When she stands, it means war. Meanwhile, she makes a strategic move that stuns everyone. She allies with the Mbangala. Now, the Mbangala are, well, complicated. They're warrior nomads known for extreme rituals, adoption rites, and battle customs that make your hair stand on end. They're feared across the region. They paint themselves in ash and blood, and they don't exactly respect traditional authority. But Nzinga? She negotiates with them, incorporates their ranks, gives them land and legitimacy in exchange for loyalty. It's controversial. Some say she's gone too far, mixing with people who reject even family ties. Others say it's genius. She's absorbing the most fearsome fighters in the region. Historians still debate whether this alliance was temporary convenience or a radical reimagining of power. But you're there when she walks into an Mbangala war camp, alone, hands unarmed, voice steady as stone. You see the warlord blink first. You see her sit beside him, share palm wine, and emerge not as a guest, but as an equal. These aren't just military moves. They're psychological. She's rewriting what power looks like, in a time when women are supposed to rule from the sidelines. If at all, Nzinga is redefining the very throne. And she's not done yet. Back at her mobile court, she establishes something extraordinary, a haven for runaway slaves. People fleeing Portuguese captivity are welcomed into her realm, trained as citizens, even soldiers. It's not just mercy, it's strategy. Every refugee is one less captive in Portuguese hands, and one more loyal subject in hers. Of course, the Portuguese see this as treason. Her head is wanted in Luanda. Jesuit letters stop being polite. They start saying words like heretic, heathen, obstruction to divine order. Nzinga just sharpens her knife. And while all this unfolds, she keeps writing letters. You help her draft one to the Dutch, a possible new ally against the Portuguese. Another to the Pope, asking for recognition as a Christian queen. She signs each one with care. Ana de Souza Nzinga, by the grace of God, Queen of Ndongo and Matamba. You watch her seal them with wax, breathe over them softly, maybe for luck, maybe for power, and send them into the winds of empire. Night falls again, softer this time. You lie beneath a mosquito net near the queen's tent, listening to the distant echo of drums. Tomorrow, there will be marching, maybe battle, but for now, there is calm. You wake to the sharp smell of smoked cassava drifting through a humid dawn. Around you, the mobile court is already stirring. Nzinga's version of government on the go. There's a kind of elegance to it. Folding tents stenciled with hand-woven symbols, armored guards who double as scribes, women with braids so tight they gleam in the sunrise. And Nzinga herself? Already up, already planning. Today, the queen is moving east, deeper into the rugged lands of Matamba. The thing about Matamba is that it's not just a backup base. It's a kingdom with its own identity, its own loyalties, its own royal family. And, inconveniently, it already has a ruler. But Nzinga doesn't do backup anything. She does takeovers. So, as you ride with her entourage along red clay roads framed by towering palms, you realize she's not just retreating, she's expanding, repositioning, rewriting her own map of power. You arrive at the edge of Matamba to a tense standoff. The local queen, more of a matronly tribal chief, really has set up a line of warriors across the river. No fighting yet, just a lot of staring and slightly too loud drumming. The message is clear: go back to Ndongo. Nzinga doesn't blink. She steps forward alone, removes her head wrap, revealing rows of ceremonial scars carved in spirals across her scalp, and begins to speak. Her voice rises over the drums, not shouting but clear, like a bell rung from the inside out. She invokes lineage, shared bloodlines, the threat of Portuguese expansion, the need for unity. She says her arrival is not an invasion. It's a merging of destinies. You can't help but admire her, or worry she's about to be impaled. But slowly the drums soften, spears lower, and the Matamba warriors part to let her through. A few months later, Queen Nzinga of Ndongo is also Queen Nzinga of Matamba. Dual crowns, dual responsibilities, and depending on who you ask, dual headaches. She begins consolidating immediately. New trade deals with the Congo Kingdom. An alliance with the Dutch bolstered by Portuguese missteps. A quiet charm offensive aimed at the matriarchal clans of the interior, who, by the way, are very intrigued by the idea of a woman ruling both courts. Nzinga isn't trying to be first at anything. She's just trying to survive with style. Meanwhile, the Portuguese scramble. They launch yet another proxy king in Ndongo, this time backed with actual muskets. Nzinga doesn't panic. She opens Matamba to displaced nobles, farmers, even poets. Yes, poets from her old court. She offers land, roles in her military, new names. She makes herself the safe bet. And here's today's quirky tidbit. Nzinga starts recruiting women into her inner military guard. Not just the support staff, actual fighters. One early chronicler insists she led an elite company of warrior women, possibly former concubines trained in hand-to-hand combat. Historians still argue whether this was myth, embellishment, or fact exaggerated by shocked Europeans. But you've seen them. And they're terrifying. One of them, Kafindanga, carries a blade carved with proverbs. Her favorite: what the snake leaves behind, the leopard eats. You assume it's a metaphor for Nzinga's enemies. She just smiles when you ask. There's something else that starts to shift now. Nzinga's use of religion. Her court, once steeped in Catholic pomp, begins to blend European rituals with older, Central African traditions. She hosts masses followed by libation ceremonies. She receives communion in the morning and sacrifices a rooster to ancestral spirits by evening. You help translate her debates with the few remaining missionaries. She tells them bluntly that her people need both salvation and rain, and she'll hedge her bets with whichever God provides both. Is it syncretism? Pragmatism? Political genius? Historians still argue whether Nzinga truly believed in Christianity or simply used it as diplomatic currency. What you know is this: she never moves without calculating the weight of her gestures. Even her prayers are strategic. And then comes the Great Offensive. By 1647, Nzinga has trained a formidable army. Some say as many as 10,000 troops. She's armed with Dutch firearms and hardened by years of hit-and-run tactics. She marches west, retaking chunks of Ndongo, fortifying towns, and offering Portuguese deserters the chance to switch sides with full pardon. It's working. In one legendary skirmish near the Kwanza River, she tricks a Portuguese commander into chasing a fleeing detachment right into a swamp. Half the enemy drowns in mud. The rest surrender after 3 hours of mosquito-assisted psychological warfare. You remember that night vividly. The fireflies blinking over puddled rice fields. The low murmur of Nzinga's voice as she thanks the ancestors for the win. Then she tosses a chicken bone over her shoulder for luck. You make a note to never play chess with this woman. But not all battles go her way. In 1648, the Portuguese receive a massive infusion of troops, fresh from Brazil. They recapture Luanda and begin pushing hard into the countryside. Nzinga's forces are scattered. Her Dutch allies retreat, citing unfavorable winds, which is probably 1600's code for "we're out of patience." So once again, Nzinga adapts. She pulls her court deeper into Matamba, reinforces trade routes, and builds what you could only call a forest-based intelligence network. Messengers disguised as hunters, code etched into woven baskets, secret meetings in termite mound shrines. It's a quieter phase of rule now, but no less sharp. Nzinga has gone from warrior to strategist to stateswoman. And while the Portuguese try to wear her down, she just outlasts them. There's a story you hear one night, passed around by old soldiers near the fire. It says Nzinga once cursed a Portuguese cannon by urinating on it in full regalia. You ask her about it the next day. She winks. Some legends don't need confirmation. Your sleep is light tonight, drifting in and out beneath mosquito nets and the low hum of jungle creatures. Nzinga's camp is quieter these days, though that doesn't mean she's resting. No, Queen Nzinga has entered what you might call her diplomatic chessboard era. You see in how she walks now. Less hurried, more deliberate. She's no longer chasing battles. She's outlasting empires. It's the 1650s. Nzinga is now in her 60s. Though she insists she feels stronger than any man who's tried to kill her. You half believe her. She still trains in spear drills at dawn, and once out drank a visiting envoy under the table using palm wine and sheer spite. You are stationed near the Matamba border when the next strange episode begins. A Portuguese governor sends an ambassador to her court with an odd proposal. Peace. Official, notarized, sealed peace. The kind with letters and ink and a very awkward handshake. Nzinga receives the emissary under a canopy of dyed raffia. She listens to the offer, clearly too generous to be sincere, and smiles politely. Then she invites him to hunt antelope with her. He declines. She doesn't press. Instead, she gives him a jar of honey and 5 live goats. He's baffled. You're not. This is Nzinga's version of "let me think about it." For the next 2 years, the queen draws out the negotiations. Every time the Portuguese make demands, She responds with a counteroffer so drenched in diplomacy you can barely tell it's a no. She asks for the return of specific territories, a recognized border, and, most provocatively, official acknowledgement of her as sovereign equal. Historians still argue whether the Portuguese ever took this seriously or were simply stalling. But the documents from this time are real. You've seen them, parchment letters sealed with wax and regret. Meanwhile, Nzinga's court evolves again. She begins grooming a successor, not one of her own children. Rumor has it she never had any, but a trusted niece named Kambu. It's a move both brilliant and deeply controversial. Some nobles grumble, but most admire the gesture. It's a matriarchal stamp of longevity. This is also when Nzinga starts holding weekly open courts. Anyone can come forward. Traders, fishermen, weavers, even an elderly woman once accused her neighbor's parrot of witchcraft. Nzinga listens to them all. She rules less like a monarch and more like an oracle. The fringe tidbit here, Nzinga had a habit of disguising herself at night and walking among the villagers. She'd ask about food prices, border tensions, who was secretly taking bribes. You once caught her smearing ash on her face to look older. She winked and said, "The ears learn more than the throne." And somehow, through all this, her power grows. European maps begin to mark Matamba in bold letters, not just as a territory, but as a political reality. Dutch traders still hover near the coast, hedging their bets. Congo envoys send lavish gifts, leopard hides, copper bracelets, smoked meat rolled in banana leaves. And the Portuguese? They start looking tired. It helps that Nzinga develops her own version of a civil service. She commissions scholars, yes, actual scribes with training, to record legal decisions, map tributary clans, and document harvests. Some historians call this the start of a formal state bureaucracy in the Central African interior. You call it genius. One afternoon, she reads aloud a poem written by a local girl about the woman with thunder in her feet. You ask if she likes it. She shrugs. "I prefer diplomacy with fewer metaphors." Then, with a quiet chuckle, she asks if you think her feet really sound like thunder. You don't answer. You've heard them. And now comes perhaps the most quietly incredible event in her long life. Nzinga signs a peace treaty. The final version, signed in 1656, recognizes Matamba as an independent kingdom. It doesn't fix every problem. There are loopholes, vague border clauses, and the ever-present issue of slave raids in contested regions. But it's a treaty, a real, diplomatic recognition of Nzinga's power. She holds a feast to celebrate. You remember it well. Roasted yams seasoned with wild garlic, a circle of drummers tapping slow rhythms, dancers in crimson sashes spinning under lantern-lit trees. Nzinga, seated in carved wood and gold-threaded cloth, raises a gourd of wine and toasts, not to victory, but to endurance. She says it softly, "I will be here when they are dust." But peace doesn't mean pause. Nzinga immediately uses the treaty to expand her internal development. She reorganizes her tribute system to reduce pressure on smaller villages. She opens 2 new market roads, one leading deep into the eastern forests, another veering south toward the Lunda Kingdom. You ride with the scouts sent to pave those paths. Well, clear them, really, using machetes and clever bribes. In one village, Nzinga leaves behind a ceremonial chair carved from termite-hollowed wood. She says it will remind people who still watches, even when far away. There's a philosophical turner now. In council meetings, she asks strange questions. What makes a kingdom last? Do birds understand maps? Should justice sound like music? You suspect these are rhetorical, but someone always tries to answer anyway. Nzinga begins speaking more openly about the ancestors. She builds a new shrine on a forest hill, dedicating it not to one god, but to all spirits who helped her survive. The altar is made from volcanic rock. She lights 3 candles at dusk. Always 3. One night, she tells you, "I have fought many battles, But peace is its own campaign. And in a way, this new phase of life is her most strategic. She's no longer just a queen, she's a symbol. To her people, to the Portuguese, to history, whether they like it or not. You wake up before dawn now, not because you're required to, but because Nzinga is already up. She's on the veranda of her residence, sipping something bitter from a carved gourd. She doesn't greet you, just gestures to sit beside her like always. This is her habit now. A ruler in her late 60s, well past the age when most warriors have long since turned to dust or poetry. And yet, she is sharp, alert, even a little playful. Her mornings have become rituals. Not religious, exactly, but sacred in their rhythm. First, the drink, a mixture of herbs, said to strengthen memory. Second, a brief audience with her personal advisors, one of whom is a former enemy commander she pardoned just to see if he'd flinch in her presence. He still does. Third, movement. She stretches her limbs slowly, with the precision of a cat surveying its kingdom. Nzinga's body has changed, of course. Her joints creak. Her sword hand isn't as steady. But her mind? Oh, her mind cuts sharper than ever. She's begun writing letters again, long, flowing declarations to European monarchs. One to the Pope, one to the King of Portugal, a few to Portuguese priests still stationed in Luanda, reminding them, in extremely polite Latin, that they owe her back taxes in the form of livestock. Some of these letters include small gifts, embroidered fans, copper jewelry, dried okra wrapped in reed mats. Others contain questions, the kind that confuse even scholars. Do your gods favor silence or shouting? Is a sin forgiven if one forgets it? And the weirdest one, if my bones are made from rebellion, will they ever rest? Historians still debate whether these were spiritual reflections or just her way of unsettling her foreign correspondence. You lean toward the latter. Meanwhile, back home, Nzinga's court enters a golden age of calm, if not quite peace. Trade is stable. The Portuguese avoid unnecessary conflict, largely because they no longer trust themselves to win. Her alliances with other African rulers begin to deepen, not through force, but through clever, gift-laden diplomacy. Here's the fringe tidbit for this chapter. Nzinga allegedly had a royal musician whose only job was to follow her around and narrate her daily actions in song. Not praise songs, just descriptive verses like, "The queen eats maize, the queen frowns, the queen counts goats." Essentially, a one-man Wikipedia page with rhythm. Some people found it charming. Others begged for silence. Nzinga naturally enjoyed the discomfort. Now, about this stage of Nzinga's life, it's not without tension. For every year of quiet, there's always a whisper of trouble. There are still slave traders moving in the shadows, and although Nzinga bans the internal sale of her own people, the external demand remains high. She struggles with this contradiction. Sometimes she enforces bans harshly. Other times she turns a blind eye, especially if those traders bring back valuable intelligence. You catch her once, staring at a pile of confiscated shackles. She doesn't say anything, just rests a hand on the metal, then walks away. These moments punctuate her final years. Deep, contemplative silences followed by bursts of intense planning. Like when she orders the rebuilding of her mother's old village, not for defense, but memory. She commissions woodcarvers to recreate ancestral homes, to record names lost in old wars, to map rivers that no longer flow. She begins calling this her Garden of Echoes. And you become more than a servant. She begins asking for your opinion during council, jokingly at first, but you sense she's serious. Her inner circle shrinks with age, and she likes keeping people around who aren't afraid to look her in the eye. One evening, she asks you to sit while she recounts every ruler she has outlived. The list takes nearly an hour. She doesn't smile once. When she finishes, she simply says, "That's how you measure power, by who's still breathing." And then she laughs because she knows it sounds terrifying. You laugh too, because it is terrifying. A mainstream fact worth noting here. Nzinga lived to be over 80 years old, an extraordinary lifespan for anyone, let alone a woman who led armies, fled jungles, endured betrayals, and ruled kingdoms. But even immortals have to plan for succession. Nzinga now begins grooming her niece, Kambu, more actively. She invites her to private strategy sessions, give her charge over certain ceremonies, and, in one startling moment, hands her a small dagger carved from zebra bone. No one listens to a woman until she bleeds for the crown, she says. Kambu doesn't flinch. She's been learning. Nzinga still tests her, though. During one meeting, she challenges Kambu's decision to let a rebellious chief off with a mere fine. Kambu defends it. Nzinga responds by hurling her staff across the room and storming out. You later find out she was delighted. Better a queen who argues than one who obeys, she tells you. Despite all this, Nzinga begins to withdraw slightly from public life. She walks slower, delegates more, spends long hours in her shrine at the edge of the forest, murmuring to the spirits. You ask her once if she feels close to death. She shakes her head. Not close, just curious. And perhaps that's the most Nzinga thing she's ever said. There's one more moment worth capturing before the curtain starts to fall. A Portuguese governor sends a new envoy to her court, a young man, full of optimism and arrogance. He brings polished gifts and empty apologies. Nzinga listens to his speech, waits for the formal bow, then asks, "Do you know who I am?" The envoy, stammering slightly, says yes. Nzinga leans forward and whispers, "Good. Then you know I will not die quietly." And she doesn't. Not yet, anyway. Nzinga is walking slower now. Not from weakness, exactly, but as though each step is a decision, a negotiation with time itself. You find yourself walking at her pace without thinking. Everyone does. When the queen moves, the rhythm of the court changes. She wears softer fabrics these days, lighter on the embroidery, heavier on the color. Her favorite shade is ochre. She says it reminds her of dust and honey. You never know which one she means more. In the mornings, her niece Kambu joins her. The two women sit side by side, not speaking. Occasionally they'll pass a palm kernel or a dried fig between them. Sometimes Nzinga hums a melody too old for any words. But make no mistake, Nzinga is still working. Even now, in her twilight, the queen is reorganizing. She sends riders to distant chiefs. She reopens trade with a coastal port that had been closed for a decade due to spiritual disagreements. Translation: someone insulted her goats. It's a long story. She also calls together a gathering of elders and trusted advisors. They meet for 3 days, discussing the line of succession, land inheritance, taxation schedules, and, somewhat surprisingly, how to make salt extraction safer for older laborers. Nzinga doesn't want anyone breaking their back for flavor. One evening, after the sun has dropped behind the baobabs, Nzinga calls you in. She's been sitting alone, cross-legged, surrounded by small clay statues. Each one represents someone from her life. Allies, enemies, long-dead siblings. She taps them lightly as she talks about them. Here's a weird fringe tidbit. One of these figurines depicts a Portuguese soldier who once tried to assassinate her with a poisoned wine gourd. She caught him, pardoned him, then forced him to become her cupbearer for a year. Never trust someone you haven't forgiven, she said. That's how you keep the upper hand. She lets you hold the figurine. It's smooth and surprisingly warm. Keep it, she says. History is lighter when shared. This is Nzinga's late philosophy. She doesn't hoard power anymore. She distributes it like seed, carefully but generously. Meanwhile, tension is still humming beneath the surface. Though her diplomacy with the Portuguese is mostly stable now, a younger generation of colonial officials is becoming restless. They view Nzinga's rule as a relic of the past, something to be studied, admired, and then replaced. One Portuguese merchant is even overheard saying, "When the old lioness dies, we'll open the gates." The man disappears 2 days later. His boots are found filled with honey near a crocodile-infested river. Now, nobody can prove Nzinga had anything to do with that. But let's be honest, you're not putting it past her. Historians still debate whether Nzinga, in these final years, had grown more ruthless or more relaxed. Some say she mellowed into grandmotherly wisdom. Others insist her mind stayed sharp and suspicious until her very last breath. You, having seen her smile with knives in her eyes, lean toward the latter. There's also a growing movement within the court to document her life. An oral chronicle passed from elder to elder, scribbled in the margins of church records and on the backs of trade ledgers. You sometimes hear priests arguing over dates. Was the Battle of Katol before the drought? No. After the crocodile incident. Remember the ambassador's shoe? These details matter, because Nzinga's legend has started to swell. Children now pretend to be her in games. Market women curse in her name when haggling. Even fishermen claim she once turned a river current to save a stranded canoe. One day, Nzinga lets you sit with her in the shrine where she keeps her royal relics. You weren't even aware this room existed until now. It's dark, fragrant with myrrh and charred herbs, and lined with objects that look like they belong in a museum. If any museum could understand them. There's a necklace made from hyena teeth, a faded Portuguese flag with a hole burned straight through it, a pair of boots stitched with cowrie shells that she says she wore the day she reclaimed Luanda. She places one item in your lap, a tiny ring carved from wood. My father made this, she says. Gave it to me when I was 6. Said it wouldn't fit until I had done something worth remembering. You ask if it ever fit. Nzinga smiles. Not yet. And suddenly, you feel the room shift. Not physically, but emotionally. As if everything is starting to wind inward. Not collapse, just coil tighter. Because Nzinga knows her time is nearing. She begins sleeping longer. Her appetite changes. She spends more hours listening than talking. You catch her, once, watching Kambu from a distance. There's pride there, but also sadness. She calls the council together one final time. Not to declare anything dramatic, but to observe. She watches how Kambu carries herself, how the others respond. And at one point, Nzinga drops her ceremonial staff onto the ground and refuses to pick it up. Kambu picks it up for her, hands it back without kneeling. Nzinga just nods. Later that night, she murmurs to you, "That was the test." You think she means the staff, but it could have been the silence, or the way the others watched, or maybe it was something deeper. Either way, she seems content. In her final months, Nzinga still greets each dawn with that same bitter drink. She still hums those old melodies. She still walks through her garden of echoes, whispering greetings to the carved ancestors. And each night, before bed, she lights a single flame beside her window. You ask her why. To remind the Portuguese I'm still watching, she says, chuckling. Then she turns away, her silhouette flickering behind the curtain, and you feel something ancient settle gently over the room. You don't know exactly when it happens, only that one morning, the palace wakes slower than usual. The birds sing, but softer. The wind moves the palm fronds, but less enthusiastically. Even the goats in the courtyard bleat like they're trying not to interrupt something sacred. Nzinga hasn't come out for a morning stroll. The door to her chamber is open, but the drapes haven't been pulled back. Kambu sits just outside, very still, her hands folded in her lap. You don't ask. You already know. Inside, the room is exactly as she always left it. A cup half full of that bitter morning brew, a slipper missing because she never wore both, and a small linen pouch filled with palm nuts on her pillow. Nzinga is lying there, quiet and still, arms resting at her sides. Her face isn't peaceful in the way poets describe it. It's firm, knowing. She looks as if she's about to issue one last command, maybe to death itself. Historians agree she died in 1663, likely at around 80 years old. Though, as with most parts of Nzinga's life, the numbers are flexible. Some claim she was older. Others insist she never really died, just stepped into the ancestral realm and slammed the door behind her. The royal mourning period begins at dusk. Drums don't play. That's a direct order left in her will. Instead, people whisper her name into bowls of water and place them in doorways, so her spirit can see how many lives she passed through. They say, Kambu, now clearly the successor, holds the funeral rites with dignity and restraint. She wears white robes threaded with thin gold lines. Nzinga's favorite color combination for days when you're not in the mood to be subtle. There's a small but surreal detail worth noting here. During the ceremony, a hawk circles the palace 3 times, then lands on the very spot where Nzinga used to sit in council. It stays there until the rites are over. Some call it coincidence. Others, a sign. You choose not to explain it either way. Sometimes mystery deserves a seat at the table. In the weeks following her passing, the entire kingdom seems to breathe differently. Markets are quieter. Court gatherings pause more often, waiting for a voice that no longer comes. The river that runs past the palace seems hesitant, as if it's also adjusting. But Kambu steps into her role with a calm grace that catches even the most skeptical nobles off guard. She doesn't copy Nzinga. She couldn't if she tried. Instead, she leads with quiet intelligence, modernizing where needed, but honoring the past in every decision. The Portuguese, of course, test her. Almost immediately, they begin probing trade routes, sending envoys with smug smiles, trying to renegotiate the terms that Nzinga hammered into stone with blood, ink, and sheer force of personality. Kambu answers these attempts with careful patience and a few subtle traps. One envoy finds himself routed into a welcoming village where he's forced to drink spicy cassava beer until he admits he doesn't understand any of the treaties he's referencing. Another ambassador is gifted a war canoe. Only later does he learn it's been cursed by a river priestess. Just lightly, for motivation. And still, throughout all this, Nzinga's presence lingers. Children play a game now where one plays Nzinga and the others have to convince her to let them live. It usually ends with mock executions or elaborate riddles. Sometimes both. A traveling sculptor arrives one day, asking to create a clay mural of Nzinga's life. He stays for weeks, gathering stories. At the final unveiling, there's a moment of silence. The queen is depicted sitting cross-legged atop a Portuguese cannon, shelling peanuts and laughing. Kambu allows it to be hung in the royal dining hall. Let her keep watching us, she says. Meanwhile, oral historians carry her tale across the continent. From Angola to the Swahili coast, from mountain villages to ocean ports, the legend grows. Some say Nzinga could speak 12 languages. Others say she had a pet leopard that only obeyed her when she sang. There's even a tale that she once made a Portuguese governor dance for his life while blindfolded, though no one agrees on the rhythm. Modern scholars try to separate myth from reality, but they're missing the point. Nzinga lived so loudly, so stubbornly, that myth and reality braided themselves together like river reeds. You pull one thread and the whole story sings. Here's one fringe detail they always argue over. Did Nzinga secretly practice elements of her native spiritual beliefs even after converting to Christianity? Some say yes, pointing to her persistent use of ancestral shrines and coded rituals. Others claim she remained sincerely devout. Historians still argue whether her faith was a political performance or a personal evolution. You suspect it was both. Like everything she did. Years later, a letter from a Jesuit priest surfaces tucked in a crumbling archive. It reads, Queen Nzinga was either the most Christian of pagans or the most pagan of Christians. I still do not know. That feels about right. Kambu eventually commissions a formal tomb for her aunt. Not lavish, but symbolic. It's built near the Garden of Echoes, under a tall tamarind tree. The inscription is simple. She refused. That's all it says. And that's all it needs to. You walk past the tomb often, sometimes stopping, sometimes not. It doesn't demand attention, but it invites reflection, much like the woman herself. Some days, when the sun sets just right, the tamarind branches look like arms held aloft, like someone is still holding court beneath them. Now that Nzinga has passed in a legend, you find yourself listening more carefully to the way people speak about her. Her name no longer sounds quite like a person. It echoes like a season, one that comes uninvited, reshapes the land, and then disappears before anyone can prepare. You begin to notice how many stories now begin with "back when Queen Nzinga," and it doesn't take long before even her rivals are quoting her like scripture. In the markets of Luanda, you overhear merchants haggling with lines she once used to shame Portuguese traders. "If your price is as firm as your handshake, I'll pay double," one woman teases. The man laughs and gives her the discount. But it isn't just local memory at work. Nzinga's story begins to cross oceans. In Brazil, among communities of escaped slaves known as quilombos, whispered tales spread of a warrior queen from Africa who fought the Portuguese to a standstill. They call her Reina Nzinga, and they say her spirit still guards those who resist. In Haiti, some maroon communities reference her in ceremonial chants. No one can say for sure how the legends got there, but the thread is undeniable. Nzinga becomes more than a name. She becomes a possibility. Here's one of those details you might miss in a textbook. A group of women in the Caribbean begin wearing head wraps in the Angolan style, calling it Nzinga's crown. Historians still argue whether this is direct cultural transmission or symbolic homage. Honestly, it doesn't really matter. It's beautiful either way. Back in Angola, Kambu institutes what she calls days of reflection. Once a year, the entire court spends 24 hours in silence, each person sitting beside a clay tablet inscribed with a piece of Nzinga's life. You participate once. Your tablet reads, "She learned Portuguese faster than the ambassador learned to keep quiet." It's hard not to smile, but legacy, like soil, can be rocky. You also start to see how Nzinga's story is shaped and sometimes weaponized. Portuguese chroniclers, uncomfortable with the idea of being repeatedly bested by a woman, begin referring to her in animalistic terms. One calls her the tigress of the jungle, as if her military genius were merely instinct. Another describes her as dangerously seductive, a common euphemism for she didn't listen when men spoke. Modern scholars try to untangle the layers. Was she ruthless? Undoubtedly. Was she morally spotless? Of course not. But then again, neither were the men who wrote history in her absence. There's a fringe debate that crops up in certain academic corners. Was Nzinga more of a masterful politician than a general? Some argue that her real strength was diplomatic manipulation, not battlefield prowess. Others insist that anyone who coordinated multiple military retreats and counteroffensives against a superior European power deserves the title of strategist. You find yourself shrugging. The categories feel too small for her, like trying to summarize a thunderstorm with a single word. Meanwhile, the physical remnants of her rule begin to disappear. The old palace in Matamba falls into disrepair, and the council chambers are reclaimed by vines and silence. A local teacher organizes a restoration effort. She tells you she wants students to learn not from the myths, but from the footprints. You visit the site during the project's early days. A group of teens digs out the old throne room, laughing as they find broken clay pipes and rusted ceremonial swords. One of them holds up a splintered wooden staff and declares, "I am Nzinga. Bow before me." No one bows, but everyone cheers. You think Nzinga would have approved. There's also an effort to locate her final resting place, which has never been definitively confirmed. Some say it's beneath the tamarind tree in the Garden of Echoes. Others insist she was buried in secret to prevent desecration. A few even believe her body was never found, only her garments neatly folded beside a pool of still water. The debate continues. Scholars sift through conflicting reports, analyzing old Jesuit letters and regional folklore. No consensus is reached. But here's something oddly comforting. It means she can't be pinned down, not even in death. A modern museum in Luanda creates a traveling exhibit titled Nzinga, Queen of Two Worlds. It features artifacts from her era, multimedia reconstructions, and a quiet audio room where visitors can listen to Angolan lullabies reportedly sung during her childhood. One particularly strange artifact included in the exhibit, a 17th century Portuguese journal entry noting how she once referred to herself in court as Queen, Warrior, and Annie Supreme. Whether she meant it sincerely or sarcastically is unclear, but you want that on a mug. Another room in the exhibit showcases the ripple effect of her reign. There are photographs of black women political leaders across Africa and the diaspora, each paired with a short quote about Nzinga's influence. "I learned to interrupt with purpose," says one. "I wear my power in silence," says another. And it's not just women. Freedom fighters of all genders reference her tactical genius, her refusal to surrender, her shape-shifting diplomacy. For many, Nzinga represents a kind of intellectual defiance that history rarely allows black leaders, let alone women. One placard reads, "Nzinga showed us that resistance is a long conversation, sometimes whispered, sometimes shouted, always worth continuing. You linger there longer than expected." Back in Angola, a contemporary theater troupe stages a surrealist play about her life, blending traditional drum circles with avant-garde set pieces. In one scene, Nzinga argues with a mirror reflection of herself dressed as a Portuguese governor. The two debate policy, justice, and the ethics of manipulating religion for politics. At one point, the reflection says, "You wore a cross, but wielded a knife," to which Nzinga replies, "As did you. I just learned faster." The audience erupts in applause. That's the thing about Nzinga's story. It's not neat. It doesn't end in triumph or tragedy. It coils back on itself, echoing through time like a drumbeat you can't quite shake. And that, perhaps, is the point. You're back in Luanda now, years later, and it's a quieter city than you remember. Or maybe it's just your age. You find yourself waking up earlier, eating slower, and staring longer at the ocean. Something about the light across the Atlantic feels gentler now. Less like conquest, more like memory. People still speak of Nzinga, but now with the kind of reverence usually reserved for saints, or perhaps sly ants who knew everyone's secrets. A mural near the docks shows her standing on a shoreline made of letters, her hands outstretched, palms open, not beckoning, not commanding, just waiting, like time itself. Today, school children take field trips to the Matamba region. They walk the same trails Nzinga's army once used to flank Portuguese garrisons. Local guides tell embellished stories of invisible horses and enchanted spears, but then pause, smile, and add, the real magic was her mind. In the classroom, students reenact moments from her life. One girl stands atop a makeshift platform and says, in an impressively stern voice, "If I must kneel, it will be on the neck of empire." The classroom cheers. Meanwhile, the international view of Nzinga continues to evolve. A controversial statue erected in Lisbon stirs debate. Some Portuguese citizens protest, insisting the bronze figure glorifies a colonial enemy. Others defend it, saying history isn't about comfort, it's about honesty. And here's a peculiar twist. The statue was funded in part by Angolan expats who live in Portugal. One donor, a quiet man in his 60s, simply said, "My grandmother made me promise." She said, "Put her where they can't ignore her." Historians still argue whether Nzinga would have approved of the statue. Some say she would have rolled her eyes at the stiff pose. Others imagine she'd secretly adore it, perhaps suggesting they had a throne made of cannonballs. A fringe historian even claims that Nzinga once commissioned a portrait of herself wearing a Portuguese naval officer's coat, purely to mess with the governor. No surviving copy has been found, but the story persists in oral tradition. The portrait is said to be hidden in a crypt beneath the ruins of an abandoned church. You visit the site. No portrait, just moss and silence, which honestly might be enough. Elsewhere, artists reinterpret Nzinga's image again and again. A Brazilian painter shows her mid-laugh, red scarf fluttering like a flag. A South African poet describes her as the sound of uncut sugar cane, sweet and sharp, all at once. A filmmaker in Ghana plans a slow, meditative documentary about her final days, shot entirely in candlelight. But your favorite tribute isn't grand at all. It's a lullaby you overhear in a quiet Angolan village. A grandmother hums to her granddaughter, "Sleep now." Nzinga's watching slash her knife in the moonlight, her smile in the trees. It gives you goosebumps. Or maybe that's the breeze. You sit with village elders who remember their own grandparents speaking of Nzinga as if she'd just left the room. One man recalls a folk belief that during storms, if you listen closely to the wind, you can hear her giving orders. Mostly strategy, he chuckles. She never wasted time on small talk. There's also a local game played by children involving carved tokens representing kingdoms. The piece that represents Nzinga is the only one that can move twice in a row. No one remembers when the rule started, but no one questions it either. Now, there's growing academic attention on Nzinga's governance. Scholars pore over translated records of her council meetings, impressed by how she rotated power, managed dissent, and built alliances through marriage, tribute, and threat. They marvel at her ability to switch between Catholic titles and traditional African rituals without missing a beat. Was she a devout believer? A spiritual manipulator? A woman caught between gods? Historians still argue whether she ever truly converted to Christianity or merely wore it like ceremonial armor. Some letters show her defending the faith with eloquence. Others catch her publicly mocking missionary behavior. And yet, her tomb, if it exists, is rumored to bear a cross. You think of that as you wander through a quiet church courtyard, where young seminarians now study side by side with historians. One of them points to a cracked tile mosaic and says, "They say Nzinga walked here, right where you're standing." You step back just in case. Ghosts deserve space. At a cafe near the university, a tired professor confides in you. "I've spent 20 years studying her," he says, "and I'm still not sure whether I understand her or just admire her nerve." You raise your coffee in silent agreement. On social media, Nzinga becomes something of a viral sensation. Memes circulate, quoting her sassiest speeches with modern emojis. One viral post reads, "When the colonizer talks over you, so you buy the room chair crowned up." Another reads, "Queen behavior is never asking for the seat, just building your own throne." You wonder what Nzinga would think of all this. Probably nothing, or maybe everything. A new generation of Angolan girls grows up thinking it's completely normal for a queen to be a military commander, a diplomat, a theologian, and a fashion icon. You overhear one girl tell her friend, "When I grow up, I want to be like Nzinga, but taller." Back at your hotel, you flip through the TV channels and catch a news story on a newly named international fellowship, the Nzinga Fund for Women in Leadership. It's backed by multiple African nations. The announcement features a quote from one of her letters. "If I cannot own peace, I shall make war my servant." The anchor stumbles reading aloud. The quote's too sharp to smooth over. You smile anyway, because that's the thing. Nzinga isn't just history now. She's become part of the global subconscious. A presence, a rhythm, like rain on palm fronds or the hum of a well-worn drum. She's proof that defiance can be graceful, that strategy can wear earrings, that power, when wielded with wit, might just leave behind echoes loud enough to outlive centuries. And somewhere, you imagine, Nzinga still listens. You wake up before dawn in a small guest house on the edge of old Matamba territory. The windows are wide open, letting in the sound of crickets and the slow rustle of banana leaves. It's cool enough that you pull the blanket a little tighter And for a moment, you lie still, thinking about Nzinga. This is where she spent her final years. Not exactly in peace, but perhaps in a kind of balance. The endless wars had quieted. Her enemies, both foreign and local, had either died, left, or decided they'd rather negotiate with her than keep losing to her. She was in her 60s now, which by 17th century standards made her practically immortal. Still, she didn't stop working. Every morning, Nzinga met with advisors. She oversaw land distribution, mediated disputes, restructured tax systems, and made sure her adopted sons and daughters were being trained for roles of governance. Her mind, sharp as ever, still ran circles around younger, more ambitious courtiers who mistakenly assumed she'd become slow. Never underestimate an old cat, she supposedly once said, especially one with claws made of law. She began focusing more on diplomacy than warfare. She opened trade with neighboring African kingdoms, not just for weapons and prestige goods, but for grain, textiles, and skilled workers. Her idea of prosperity was rooted in daily bread, not just shiny gifts. The Portuguese, sensing the long game, sent emissaries with less arrogance and more humility. One even offered her a European-style crown and scepter. She laughed, declined, and replied, "Why would I want one crown when I already wear 3? Still, there was something she wanted: legitimacy. Not from Europe, but from her own people. She organized festivals that blended Catholic rites with traditional Mbundu rituals. Some missionaries were horrified, others secretly fascinated. Historians still argue whether this was a personal expression of faith or a calculated political strategy to unify her subjects across cultural lines. One scholar says it best: Nzinga didn't convert to Catholicism. She colonized it. As you imagine these ceremonies, you see flickers of firelight in the bush, drums beating slow, women ululating, elders lifting carved wooden figures while a priest raises a crucifix. Everyone chants. No one blinks. You think about how belief systems don't have to clash. They can weave. At her side was Kambu, her trusted sister, now old and stern and still radiating loyalty like heat. Nzinga once said, "I trust her more than I trust the wind." And that was saying something, since the wind had saved her armies more than once. She also surrounded herself with younger protégés, some biological, many adopted. Nzinga had no surviving children of her own, but she appointed heirs with care. She'd lost too much to trust bloodlines alone. One of her chosen successors, a quick-witted woman named Mukambu, was known for her ability to memorize entire council debates and then quote them back word for word, often to everyone's embarrassment. Nzinga loved her for it. And still, Nzinga trained daily. Sword drills, archery, riding. She once beat 3 men in a wrestling match after a council meeting. "Just keeping limber," she said, brushing dust from her skirt. Here's something quirky. In her last decade, she insisted on waking at precisely 3:33 a.m. every morning. Not 3, not 4, 3:33. When asked why, she said, "The spirits prefer symmetry." Was it superstition? Maybe. But she claimed her best ideas came to her between that half-dream state and sunrise. You imagine her sitting on a carved stool, sipping fermented palm wine, scribbling thoughts on a bark paper scroll while the stars begin to fade. She's not just ruling. She's shaping a legend while living in it. Around this time, emissaries from the Pope reached out again, offering to recognize her as a Christian monarch. Nzinga responded politely, sent a delegation, and then didn't change a single policy. The Vatican was baffled. "Is she with us or not?" they asked. Historians still debate the answer. One thing's clear: Nzinga didn't need their blessing to sleep well at night. A Portuguese traveler later described seeing her in these final years. Her bearing was neither haughty nor meek. She greeted me with laughter, insulted my boots, and then asked after my mother. Sounds about right. She kept her bodyguard of Amazonian women, too. though fewer than in wartime. These elite guards, tall and expressionless, followed her even into prayer. One young recruit reportedly asked Nzinga why they always walked barefoot. "To feel the earth remember us," she replied. By now, she'd become something of a living legend. Children whispered stories about her shadow walking ahead of her. Merchants left extra offerings near her palace gates, just in case her spirit liked snacks. You wander through what's left of her capital. The old stonework is worn but proud. A section of wall bears an inscription in both Portuguese and Kimbundu. Nzinga passed here. She walked like thunder. There are rumors she knew death was coming. One version claims she ordered a final council meeting, where she smiled and said, "The sword is heavy. I am ready to set it down." Another version has her slipping away silently in her sleep after one last moonlit ride through the tall grasses. But your favorite story is this, that she called in all her enemies, those still alive, and forgave them. Not with some grand speech, just a nod and a bowl of soup. Then she lay down, pulled the blanket to her chin, and whispered something no one caught. Her burial place is still debated. Some say it was marked with stones that shifted with the seasons. Others claim a hidden grove near the Kwanzaa River where flowers never wilt. And of course, there's always the theory that she's not buried at all, but riding still in the dark places of the forest. You close your eyes and listen. The wind picks up just slightly. Was that hoofbeats? Time stretches gently now, like a reed bending in the river current. You lean back beneath the shade of a jacaranda tree, purple blossoms falling quietly around you, and let the sound of distant drums drift through your ears. The story isn't quite over, not yet. Nzinga may have passed on, but what she left behind refused to vanish with her. After her death in 1663, the kingdoms of Ndongo and Matamba found themselves at a crossroads. She had kept the Portuguese in check for over 4 decades, not just through force, but through shrewd diplomacy, symbolic theatrics, and yes, the occasional backroom deal. But with the queen gone, her successors had big shoes to fill. Or sandals, in her case. Very practical sandals, usually hand-stitched and often scented with herbs to keep the mosquitoes at bay. Because even warrior queens have to deal with bug bites. Nzinga's chosen heir was one of her adopted daughters, Barbara, a Catholic convert with a level head and a quiet sort of charisma. Barbara tried to maintain her mother's policies, balancing Portuguese demands with local autonomy, but it wasn't easy. The colonial presence was growing bolder, armed with fresh troops, and more interested in territorial control than trade agreements. Still, Nzinga had built more than a dynasty. She had planted an idea that African kingdoms could be independent, that women could rule not just as consorts, but as commanders and lawmakers. That diplomacy didn't mean submission. That culture could be weaponized as cleverly as steel. Her death did not erase her story. In fact, it did the opposite. Oral historians across the Mbundu world began to share tales of her youth, her battles, her cleverness. With every retelling, the details evolved. In some versions, she tamed a lion and rode it into battle. In others, she tricked a ghost into revealing buried treasure. One tale claims she disguised herself as a man, then as a woman, then as both at once, just to confuse a Portuguese ambassador. Historians still argue how much of the oral tradition matches the archival record. One professor famously said, "With Nzinga, the myth is part of the fact." And maybe that's okay. You don't rule for 40 years in the middle of a colonial war zone without leaving behind some tall tales. There's even a theory, brace yourself for this one, that Nzinga faked her own death, that she wanted to vanish before her enemies could gloat, and that she walked away from her court in disguise, living out her last days as a humble healer in the highlands. The only evidence? A diary fragment from a Dutch traveler who described a wrinkled old matron with a military bearing and a habit of speaking in riddles. Could be nothing, or it could be Nzinga, chuckling behind a mug of sorghum beer. You stroll through a modern Angola marketplace now. The air smells of roasted peanuts, grilled cassava, and 1,000 conversations. Brightly dressed vendors call out prices. Music blares from a speaker shaped like a cartoon chicken. And then you see it, a mural. It's Queen Nzinga, larger than life, painted in bold colors across a concrete wall. She stands tall, one hand on a spear, the other holding a book. Her expression is calm, fierce, compassionate, all at once. The artist has added modern touches, a cell phone clipped to her belt, a pair of sneakers peeking from under her royal robes. You smile. Nzinga lives on, not just in books or songs or lectures, but in the way people imagine power, in the way daughters are raised to lead, in the way negotiators sit a little straighter when they speak. In 2013, Angola officially declared her birthday, October 17th, as Queen Nzinga Day. It's not a somber affair. It's filled with dance, reenactments, food, and laughter. School children wear cardboard crowns and practice her speeches. Street performers reenact her famous standoffs with Portuguese governors, often with exaggerated accents and comedic flair. And of course, there's the annual Nzinga debate, a public contest where young women stand before a crowd and argue policy as if they were sitting in her royal court. No pressure. One girl, age 11, once opened her speech with, "If I were Nzinga today, I'd cancel school and double lunch." She got a standing ovation. You return to her capital, modern-day Melange. A statue rises at the city's edge, bronze, gleaming in the sun. Queen Nzinga atop a war horse, cloak billowing, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Some critics argued it should have shown her seated in her famous throne. Others said it should have featured her as a peacemaker, not a warrior. But the sculptor had an answer. Nzinga was never just one thing. You can almost hear her voice in the breeze. Let them debate. I'll still be here when they're done. Nzinga's story, while anchored in a specific time and place, has traveled far beyond Africa. In Brazil, where many enslaved Mbundu people were taken, Nzinga became a symbol of resistance. Candomblé practitioners invoked her as a spirit of strength. In Haiti, she was honored alongside other revolutionary figures. In the U.S., scholars and activists cite her when discussing African feminist legacies. There's a quiet satisfaction in knowing that someone who outmaneuvered colonizers for 4 decades continues to outmaneuver erasure. Even museums struggle to contain her. There's no single exhibit that can sum her up. Some focus on her military genius, others on her religious diplomacy, others still on her identity as a woman in power. Yet none of these feel complete, because Nzinga wasn't just a chapter in a textbook. She was a moving force, and still is. Some scholars try to rank her among world leaders. You know, greatest queens in history, top 10 military minds, that kind of thing. But it feels silly. Nzinga doesn't need rankings. She was Queen Nzinga. That's enough. So here you are now, surrounded by her echoes. They're in the architecture, in the language, in the way a grandmother gently corrects her grandson's grammar with a raised eyebrow that says, Nzinga would not approve. You sit by the Kwanzaa River. The sun is starting to dip, scattering golden light across the water. Somewhere in the distance, a fisherman sings an old tune. You recognize the rhythm. It's from a story about a woman who refused to kneel. You take a deep breath. The river flows on. The air begins to cool now, as evening settles in over the hills of northern Angola. A breeze carries the scent of blooming hibiscus and distant cooking fires. You move slowly through the last chapters of Nzinga's legacy. More echoes than declarations now. Quieter signs that her life's ripples never truly faded, only softened. Let's go back for a moment, not to her, but to the world she shaped. After Nzinga's death, the kingdoms she once united began to strain under competing pressures. Portuguese officials tightened their grip on the coast, while the interior peoples juggled local rivalries, missionary politics, and shifting trade alliances. But Nzinga had left them with something invaluable: time. Time bought through decades of delay and defiance. Time to build institutions, organize resistance networks, and lay the groundwork for a distinct political identity. Her military campaigns didn't just win battles. They disrupted Portuguese timelines and budgets. A footnote you might enjoy: one frustrated colonial governor described her as a permanent impediment to imperial reason. High praise, really. Her successors tried, often bravely, to hold the center. Barbara, her adopted daughter and chosen heir, governed Matamba for several years. She retained Jesuit advisors, more for the diplomacy than the doctrine, and continued Nzinga's delicate juggling act of foreign appeasement and internal strength. It wasn't easy. The Portuguese were getting more aggressive, and the economic landscape was shifting as new Atlantic trade networks emerged. Still, Matamba didn't collapse overnight. Far from it. The kingdom remained a recognizable political entity well into the 18th century, far longer than many European observers expected. Nzinga's legacy had staying power. Now, picture this: a Portuguese fort commander in the 1700s, leafing through an outdated intelligence report that describes Queen Nzinga as a current threat, despite her having been dead for nearly 60 years. You almost want to whisper, "Check the date, my guy." And yet, maybe that's the point. Nzinga had become more than a ruler. She was a symbol, and symbols don't die easily. Her story traveled faster than muskets or missionary ships. Oral tradition kept her vivid in people's minds. She appeared in songs, market stories, lullabies. One merchant described seeing a fabric print bearing her likeness, a stylized silhouette, all sharp cheekbones, and a towering head wrap, being sold in Luanda. Centuries later, school children in Angola would memorize her speeches and perform them for visiting officials. Some stumble on the older Kimbundu words, but the rhythm carries through. Of course, her memory didn't always stay pristine. Colonial narratives tried to warp her legacy. Early European historians, clearly flustered by a woman who outsmarted them, painted her alternately as a savage tyrant or a tragic convert. Some even claimed she was bewitched, a convenient excuse for being outmaneuvered, if you ask me. Historians still argue whether Nzinga genuinely embraced Catholicism or simply used it as a diplomatic tool. Was she devout? Strategic? A bit of both? There's evidence to support each view, but the question itself reveals a modern tension. We often want our historical figures to fit neatly into categories: hero, villain, believer, skeptic. Nzinga didn't comply then, and she doesn't now. What's interesting is how modern Angola has reframed her. During the country's independence movement in the 20th century, Nzinga became a rallying figure. Anti-colonial groups invoked her as proof that resistance had deep roots, that defiance was not a new impulse, but part of the national soul. In 1975, when Angola finally gained independence from Portugal after a brutal and prolonged war, Nzinga's image was everywhere. Statues, stamps, parade banners. Her legacy helped stitch a modern identity from fragmented colonial wounds. And still, her story wasn't complete. Feminist scholars in the 1980s and 90s began to reclaim Nzinga not just as a national figure, but as a feminist icon. They pointed to her military leadership, her control over marriage customs, her power in court politics. She didn't just define norms, she rewrote them. One of your favorite examples? Nzinga's reorganization of gender roles in her royal guard. She often surrounded herself with women dressed as men and men dressed as women, challenging traditional ideas of strength and leadership. Was this symbolic theater? Subversive politics? A personal aesthetic? Possibly all three. A recent performance artist in Luanda recreated this with a modern twist, holding a silent parade in which participants dressed in mirror-reversed 17th century court garb. The crowd loved it. One little boy shouted, "Nzinga's here!" and the entire square burst into applause. It's easy to forget that Nzinga didn't begin as a legend. She began as a younger sister, one caught in a web of family rivalries, fragile alliances, and colonial aggression. Through sheer will, she clawed her way into power, held it with both hands, and molded it into something larger than herself. But you remember the details now. The chair she refused to sit on. The bloodstained treaties she refused to sign without leverage. The forest roads where she rode, cloak flapping, sword at her hip. The smoke from fires she kindled at dawn to warm her warriors before battle. They're still out there, those traces of her. In the ruins of old Matamba forts, in the echo of diplomatic ceremonies, in the hush before someone starts a story with "Let me tell you about the queen who wouldn't kneel." And tonight, as you drift further into rest, you feel the shape of that memory pressing gently around you. Nzinga's life was many things. Violent, brilliant, sorrowful, strategic, mythic. But most of all, it was lived entirely on her own terms. In the quiet between breaths, you hear her laugh. Still here, still watching. You're lying back now, deeper in the calm of this long, winding night, and the dust of Nzinga's age begins to settle. But her story, it refuses to end with silence. It keeps humming along the spine of the continent, echoing through border crossings and bedtime tales. Tonight, let's walk with her ghost, not the spooky kind, but the stubborn, regal sort that refuses to be forgotten. Because Nzinga didn't vanish into history books. She slipped into the collective memory of a continent. First, you pass through the capital city of Luanda. It's hot, the air heavy with ocean salt and exhaust fumes. You dodge the honking of moto taxis and street vendors selling grilled plantains on skewers. And right there, in the middle of it all, she stands, bronze and unmoved. Queen Nzinga, sword raised, feet planted. Her statue watches over the traffic from a roundabout, as though she's still guarding the kingdom. Locals barely glance at her anymore. She's part of the scenery. But kids still ask, is it true she fought off the Portuguese with just a look? And their parents smile, saying, not just a look, but that help. It's strange, isn't it? How a life of hardship and bloodshed has become comfort. Nzinga, the warrior queen who terrified governors, now soothes a new generation. Some teachers say her name before exams like a blessing. Even a local energy drink once bore her face, marketed, of course, as unyielding power. And yet, the image most scholars agree on isn't the warrior pose. It's Nzinga as diplomat, head high, back straight, scanning a room of enemies and smiling just enough to unsettle them. It's said that she rarely blinked during negotiations, and that one ambassador described the pressure of her presence as sitting beneath a cliff's edge, waiting for it to fall. Historians still debate whether her fierceness was performance or instinct. Did she calculate every move like a chess grandmaster, or was she simply born unwilling to yield? No one can say for certain. The answer probably lives somewhere in the middle, between strategy and raw defiance, in that slim space where survival becomes art. And what about the writings left behind? That's where things get trickier. Most of what we know about Nzinga comes from foreign observers. Portuguese priests, Dutch merchants, and military scribes. Which means her story is laced with filters, misreadings, and the occasional outright lie. There are diaries that describe her as charming but savage, masculine in will, feminine in manipulation. You can practically see the fragile egos squirming through the ink. One priest even claimed Nzinga turned her male concubines into eunuchs for fun, a claim most modern scholars dismiss as colonial hysteria rather than fact. And yet, despite those distortions, Nzinga's voice still hums beneath the surface. You find it in the rhythm of the letters she dictated to European courts, in the phrasing of her ultimatums, in the cultural memory of Kimbundu oral poets who refused to let the colonizers write the last word. One of the most peculiar accounts comes from a 17th century Dutch trader named Jan van der Graaf. He described being summoned to her court in Matamba and finding her playing a board game, possibly Mancala, against one of her commanders. She was winning, naturally, but what caught his eye wasn't the game. It was the silence in the room. He claimed no one dared speak until she did. Her gaze controlled the air, he wrote, as if conversation waited for her permission to exist. Now that's power. And what about Nzinga's personal world? Her habits, her rituals? You wonder, as you drift, what her quiet hours looked like. Did she rise early or sleep late? Did she have favorite foods, secret fears? Was she ever lonely? Some say she kept a pet monkey. Others insist she wore armor, even in bed. There are rumors that she consulted diviners before every campaign and that she occasionally vanished into the forest for days, emerging with new strategies no one else could explain. There's even a whisper in some Angolan folktales that Nzinga never truly died, that she walked into the jungle one final time and simply kept walking. The vines swallowed her. The path closed behind. And every so often, when a thunderstorm rolls across the plateau, someone swears they see her silhouette on the horizon, cloak whipping in the wind. Of course, it's just a story, but a useful one, because in that tale, Nzinga becomes more than a monarch. She becomes motion, possibility, a reminder that even in systems designed to erase her, she endured. You think back to her early years now. The royal daughter who wasn't supposed to inherit. The teenage girl who watched her people sold and her father's power crumble. The young woman who stared down a colonial governor without flinching. The elder queen who played empires like puppets and carved a nation from refusal. And yet, she laughed too. You can be sure of that. Even the fiercest among us get tickled by something. A mispronounced oath. A priest tripping over his robes. A loyal retainer trying to invent a new proverb and failing spectacularly. That's the Nzinga we rarely meet in textbooks, the woman behind the mask. She had to wear it, of course, but behind it, she was flesh and will and humor. And maybe just a little tired, because being indomitable is exhausting work. As you drift now, eyes heavier, limbs softer, you begin to feel the weight of her life not as burden, but as ballast, something anchoring you gently to the earth. The wind outside brushes the window like a silk curtain stirred by history. And still she stands, not just in bronze or in bedtime stories, but in the sheer possibility that even the smallest resistance can echo for centuries. Nzinga doesn't need your worship. She'd probably raise an eyebrow if you tried. But she wouldn't mind your attention. And tonight, you gave it freely. She bows just a little and vanishes into the dark. The air tonight is slower. You're not just resting, you're sinking. The last threads of the story begin to fade into moonlight, but we've got one more stretch to walk with Queen Nzinga. Not as ruler, not as warrior, but as elder, as memory. You wake in the royal compound of Matamba, older now, but so is she. It's the late 1660s. Nzinga is past 70, a number most of her enemies never reached. Her bones ache in the mornings, and she walks more slowly, though no one dares point it out. She still carries herself like a blade. But the wars are mostly over. Treaties have been signed, redrawn, ignored, and signed again. Nzinga no longer charges into battle on horseback. These days, she rules from her shaded pavilion, her throne a carved seat under the thick palms, with a fan of peacock feathers waving the heat away. The kingdom is quieter now, though always watching. You sit beside her in the shade. There's the distant sound of drums, not for war, but for celebration. A harvest, or perhaps just a Tuesday. In her older years, Nzinga encouraged more ceremonies, more joy. She knew that a kingdom couldn't survive on fear and clever diplomacy alone. It needed stories. It needed rhythm. What does Nzinga think about legacy? She doesn't speak of it often, but sometimes, in quiet conversations with her closest advisors, she wonders aloud what Angola will look like without her. She wonders if her people will keep their identity, their language, their laughter. Historians still argue whether her final years were peaceful or paranoid. Some accounts suggest she never let go of her sword, that she had it near her even as she slept. Others say she mellowed, took up poetry, or spent hours talking to birds in the garden. The truth, as always, is probably somewhere in between. Nzinga was never one thing. She was contradiction wearing a crown. Even her death remains wrapped in legend. The official records say she died in 1663 peacefully in bed. Some believe she had a priest at her side. Others say she whispered an oath to the ancestors. And some, well, you've heard this one before. Some say she didn't die at all, that her heartbeat is buried under the Angolan soil, pulsing every time a woman refuses to yield. Her funeral was grand. You imagine it now. Trumpets, chants, processions winding through the jungle paths, past the rivers she once used as battlegrounds. Her people dressed in both mourning cloth and battle garb, as if to say, "We cry, but we do not surrender." The Portuguese attended too, stiff in their uniforms, uncertain whether to feel sorrow or relief. A queen they could never conquer had finally left the field. Or had she? As sleep pulls you closer now, think of this. Nzinga's resistance wasn't just about spears and treaties. It was about dignity, about holding the shape of yourself when the world tries to fold you in half. She didn't stop the slave trade. She couldn't. The wheels of empire were too vast, too hungry. But she bent them, even briefly. She reminded the world that Africans were not pawns or prophets. They were sovereign. They had names, languages, grandmothers who told jokes with a side eye, and warriors who could quote proverbs in 3 dialects before breakfast. Nzinga didn't need to be perfect to be powerful. She made mistakes. She compromised. She fought dirty when she had to. But she never disappeared. And now, in modern Angola, her name is taught in schools. Her face adorns currency. She's become both symbol and ancestor, not frozen in idealism, but alive with grit. Her kingdoms, Ndongo and Matamba, may no longer exist on modern maps, but their spirit, you can still find it in the music, in the defiant tilt of a dancer's chin, in the carved masks worn during dry season festivals, in the stories passed down during blackout evenings when the power cuts and the old stories switch on. And now, you've become a part of that chain. You, lying there somewhere between thought and dreaming, have walked the red soil of history barefoot. You've watched the rise of a girl who refused to kneel, who turned treaties into weapons and weapons into warnings. Queen Nzinga, the woman who made kings sweat and generals stammer, who ruled with both an open hand and a closed fist, who bent when she had to, but never broke. Not really. So tonight, if you find yourself drifting through dreams, and you pass a clearing where the trees hush themselves, and a woman in full regalia waits with arms crossed and a half-smile on her lips, don't be afraid. Just nod. She's been expecting you. Now let go of the story. Let the embers fade. All that's left is the warm quiet of the night. You've made it all the way to the end, and now the story dissolves like mist. There's nothing left to follow. No more battles, no more councils, no more kingdoms to defend. Just breath and stillness, and the faint sense of having traveled far. Your body, warm and still, sinks deeper into the mattress. The air around you softens. Every sound feels like a whisper from far away. Maybe your eyelids are already closed, or maybe they flutter gently, half watching shadows on the wall. Either way, there's no need to focus anymore. You're safe. You're still. You might feel your chest rise and fall with ease now, each breath a little slower than the last. Inhale, exhale, like the tide on some distant Angolan shore, lapping against the place where Nzinga once watched the horizon, where she once waited for the next ship, for the next challenge. But you don't have to wait for anything. The night belongs to you now. No decisions, no strategies, just the gentle comfort of being here exactly as you are. held in the arms of sleep. Let your mind drift. Let the images of royal courts and jumbled trails blur into background texture. Let Nzinga's spirit step back into the trees. She's at peace now, and you are too. You've done enough. You've heard enough. And now, there's nowhere to be but here. May your dreams be quiet and your rest long.